So some of you are having some problem with the player object going through the platform when it's moving downwards, right? And it doesn't seem to be happening very consistently. So it's a little bit puzzling why that's happening. So let me just quickly explain why that's happening, and then we can talk about how we can fix it. Right? Let me just turn off Playmaker gizmos here. So essentially, we're comparing, the current system is that we're comparing this point with this point, right? And when the object is moving downwards, theoretically it should hit here and detects a collision, right? And at which point this is still above this point, right? The foot point is still above the top point here. But what's actually happening in the system is whenever an object is moving, it's not moving sort of smoothly like that. It's moving at a per frame. So every frame is moving at a distance, right? So this is one frame. The next frame you might be moving here, and then the next frame you might be here, and the next frame is here. So it's a very small jumps basically. That's how an object moves, right? So when an object is moving really fast, and that jump is bigger, right? So you might be here at the first frame, and then you might be here in the next frame when an object is moving really, really fast, and then the next frame here, the next frame here. And what happens if you're in the previous frame you're here, and the block is solid, the collider is turned on, but in the next frame you're here, and the block is no longer, the collider is no longer enabled. And in this frame, because the object hasn't touched the platform, the collision didn't happen. And in this frame, because we've turned the collider off, then the collision again does not happen. So the player object will simply go through the platform, right? So that's the problem we're facing here, and this will happen if your object is moving really fast, or if this point that we're using is too high, right? So it doesn't give a lot of buffer to this problem, right? So imagine if this point is a little bit lower, then we have a bit more room to give, a bit more room to have that error. So that's the first thing you can try to do if you're seeing this problem. Now, not all of you are going to see this problem. It depends on your setup. It depends on how fast you're moving this object and where these 2 points are. So I'm not actually seeing this problem in my version of the game, but you might very likely see it, right? So a quick way to fix that, the first thing that you can try is go to the prefab and just move the top point down. I move it down a little bit, move it down to 0, and this will help prevent some of that problems, because now we're giving a bit more room here. So if on this frame is here, next frame is even here a little bit, it's still okay. It can still, it's still the collider is still turned on. We'll still have that collision. So that's the first thing you can try, is just by moving this top point. Let me just revert that change. Okay, now the second thing we can do is, instead of using these 2 points, we're just gonna detect if the player is moving upwards or downwards. So this is kind of similar to how we fixed the super jump problem, and we're going to do exactly the same thing. And I think some of you have mentioned, have offered help in the forum using this method as well. But let me just quickly create a new mechanism for the collider, and then you can see it's actually really quick to do. Okay, so make sure we're selecting the prefab. And what I want to do is I want to temporarily just turn off the collider control playmaker state machine, because we're not going to use that. This is the one that's controlling the on and off of the collider, right? Okay, so make sure we're selecting the prefab, and I want to add a new FSM, and I'm going to call this collider control 2 for now. Okay, and we need to get the initial state because we need to find the player object so we can compare, so we can find out if the player object is moving upwards or downwards, right? So let's first define that player object, and that's a game object, and in the initial state I'm going to find that object. So this is fairly straightforward. We've done this a few times now. Okay, now we've got that. Right, player, but find the player object with the player tag, and then put it in the player object variable. Okay, finish. And when the game starts, the player object would be falling, right? It would be going downwards, and then that's when everything should have the collider enabled. So I think the first state should be collider enabled. And then the next state is, of course, collider disabled. Okay, and then what we want to do is, first, we want to set the collider, right? So there's a quick way to do the set property action, which is you can just drag the component into PlayMaker and then select set property, and it will just grab that component, put it in here so you can quickly manipulate it. So I'm going to enable this set property, and in the collider disabled state I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to disable it, so I'm going to leave that unchecked. Okay, next is I want to check if the player is moving upwards or downwards, and then we'll decide what to do based on that. So the first thing I need is a float variable called player y velocity. Okay, and I'm going to just get velocity here. Again, this is exactly the same as what we did when fixing the super jump, and I'm going to get the velocity of the player object, store the velocity on y to player y velocity variable, and I want to check every frame, right? And I'm going to copy this, put it over here as well, right? Same thing, just getting the velocity and checking which way the player is going. Okay, and then finally we'll do a float compare, and we're going to compare the player y velocity with 0. We just want to know if it's bigger than 0 or not, like we want to know the sign. And we want to do this every frame, just double checking this is every frame, world space, good. And if it's greater, then we're going to disable the collider, right? If it's greater than 0, that means the object is moving upwards on the y-axis. Then we want to disable all the colliders. So when the object is moving up, we're going to turn off all the colliders so the player object can go through them. Okay, then copy this, paste this over, and here we want the opposite. Right, so when the player is moving downwards, then we want to go to finished and enable the collider. And just for safety, I'm gonna, just in case if the player velocity is at 0, then I want it to be, I want the colliders to be enabled as well. Okay, So let's see if that works. Now remember, I've disabled the collider control. Now all the collider changes are going to be through this new state machine, collider control 2. Okay, hit play. Okay, so seems to be working. Let's just video is a little bit chubby, but seems to be working all right. So this is another way to manage the platforms, the colliders on the platforms. Okay, so that's how you set it up. Instead of using 2 points, now I can actually remove them and it will still work, but I'm not going to do that. You can experiment with them if you want. You can just sort of disable them. If I just disable them, right, they're not in the scene anymore, but it should still work. Yep, still working. So that's how you can fix that problem if you're seeing that.